Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why I have most of my clients sumo deadlift and why I recommend that everyone out there train the sumo deadlift. Now, when I say this, it has nothing to do with thinking that the sumo deadlift is what you should be using for competition in powerlifting or anything like that. Even though I am a power lifter, I don't necessarily think everyone should pull sumo. I think you should pull whichever allows you to lift the most weight in competition, right? And when you go to set a PR and say, this is what I can deadlift, you use whatever deadlift style you can lift the most weight as long as it's a recognized deadlift. And in the sport of powerlifting, they recognize sumo. And in the sport of like strength lifting, which is much, much, much smaller, maybe has 0.5% of the number of people who compete, if that, they only recognize a conventional. Of course, you go over to strongman and they recognize conventional with all sorts of variations of it with straps and suits and everything else. So when it comes to the sumo, there's a reason I want people to train the sumo, and it has to do with the fact that if you can't perform sumo, it represents a strength imbalance, right? It represents muscular development issues in your lower body. Okay? And we could call it range of motion, we can call it mobility, and a lot of it does have to do with mobility, right? If for example, you can conventional deadlift 405, but you struggle to break 315 off the floor on a sumo, right, that is definitely a mobility issue, because if you can physically get into the position to sumo, but you can't generate force, we have a mobility issue. Okay, what does that mean? It means certain parts of your quad are weak. It means your hips are weak. Okay? And if you have weak quads and weak hips, that represents a big problem, doesn't it? In terms of overall athletic performance, muscle balance, injury prevention, all these things. So by doing this, it teaches us to learn to do things with a wider stance. And the issue with the sumo that people run into there is the fact that they're not good at wide stance stuff. Well, if you're not good at wide stance stuff, I think most people realize that can be a problem for different sports and athleticism. And all of us should be striving to be balanced in terms of our movement patterns and our ability to produce force through all the normal movement patterns. And a wide stance is one of those. And again, if you ever need to pivot or shift on one foot, if you can't do anything wide stance, I think you're going to find that you run into issues there. You run into issues. And so because of this, I tend to have people learn the sumo early on, even if I get clients who I would still classify as being more or less novices. We start with the sumo deadlift. And a lot of people will say, well, Jason, don't they need to learn conventional? You can be good at conventional while barely doing conventional. In other words, what did you guys see me do all of last year? Almost entirely sumo pulling. And I walk in and I deadlift 615, which is what you just saw right there. I did 2 normal conventional pulls, 605 and then 615. I mean, I built that doing other movements to build all the deadlift muscles, but my pulling from the floor was generally sumo. And I've kind of gone back to that because, again, this is what I know works. We have more muscular development involved in the lower body by doing this. And by that same token, if we do all of our volume pulling sumo, we end up with better quad development. And for a lot of us, that becomes the issue. If we're focusing really heavy on the posterior chain all the time, which we should be for sports purposes, doing our training volume on the sumo will help get us extra quad development that will carry over to wider stance squats, because it builds it in the same way. So we can do wide stance squats, and we can also be stronger on our squats. Because again, we get more practice with stuff in the wide stance. And I think something that people need to realize too, if you want the strongest squat possible, it's going to be with a wide stance. And if you're not stronger with a wide stance on the squat, that's a problem. Because in theory, you should be. More muscles get involved, and you can maintain a more upright bar path. So if you're weaker on the wide stance squat or you can't do it, again, this represents a major muscle imbalance. And even for people who would say, well, what's the point of the wide stance squat? Well, even for muscle building purposes, more muscles are involved. Okay, if we're going to use a squat for any form of development, wouldn't we want the most muscle involvement? Particularly for our lower body. You want it to be easier on your back. And that's the point we come to with the sumo. It's easier on your back. We can do more training volume and recover from it. So that's the other point that we have to come to with it. The sumo deadlift puts less shear on the lumbar. People can say, well, it's not that much difference. Of course it's not that much difference. It doesn't have to be that much difference. We're talking about stimulus versus fatigue ratios. And we're talking about stimulus versus fatigue ratios if we look at something from a recovery perspective, let's say for low back recovery, which is frequently our limiting factor, by the way. I mean, if we want to talk about our limiting factor in our ability to do big lifts for the low body, your low back recovery is usually the biggest, if not the biggest, limiting factor. Amount of axial loading we can handle, the amount of shear we can handle on the low back and still recover. There's a reason I'm big into traction stuff. There's a reason I do all these reverse hypers. The reason I tell most of you if we're going to do additional quad work, stuff like a hip belt squat would be the way to go. It's not arbitrary. All right, it has to do with being able to do more training volume. So we could look at that and say, okay, so it might be only 10% less total shear stress on the back. Well, that means we can do 10% more training volume. And our issue with training volume is always recovery. You know, people can argue about volume, say, well, this study or that study showed at a certain point no extra growth happened or less growth happened. Yeah, it's because there were recovery issues. And because a lot of times when they do studies, they're so far behind the curve, they're not looking at different exercise variations and saying, hey, what has the stimulus versus fatigue that we need? They're just picking the biggest basic exercises and pushing them to maximum volumes to see how people respond. And that's problematic in the studies. And the difference we have with a lot of those studies looking at that is that they're 20 years behind the strength and conditioning world and what the top coaches do. Right? They're studying old variables. They're basically just trying to confirm things that we already know from the strength world and look at the different variables and find the fine details. They're very, very, very far behind on that. Okay, they're very far behind, especially when we look at things like those GBT studies. And I think that's the difference that people will find is that when we look at a lot of these lifts, we really look closely at how much training we can do versus the fatigue and the recovery of some of the different variations. This is what a lot of the best coaches have noticed is that we can push higher training volumes with certain exercises, and the sumo deadlift being one of them. And if we can push higher training volumes and get more stimulus and still recover from it, even if it's only 10% more, 20% more, that's massive in the grand scheme of things, because the only downside to more volume in our training as far as quality volume goes, not just chunk volume, is our capacity to recover and our capacity to have overload from all of it. Okay, that's usually what we're fighting against. If recovery was not an issue, more training volume would always be better. All right? And hopefully people understand that. Recovery is always a limiting factor. In other words, if everyone had Wolverine's magical regeneration, you could do 30 max deadlifts every day. And we wouldn't care about the negatives from the fatigue side because it wouldn't matter. And you would be jacked. Okay, you could do 30 max deadlifts every day if you had that. And you would probably have 1,000-pound deadlift within 6 weeks. Because again, we're dealing with recovery, regeneration of tissue. That's our limiting factor. We recover faster from sumo. It means we can do more of it. We can do it for our speed work. We can do it for our volume training. Right? A lot of my guys, I have no issues at a certain point making them do 10 moderately heavy singles on sumo like twice a week. I have plenty of lifters who do that who are non-advanced, And then when they get advanced, we obviously cut that out and go to all conjugate. But they have no trouble doing that. A lot of times those weights that are 85% plus of their max, we're sitting at 85%. Not uncommon for us to do 10 singles twice a week. And my guys all get stronger doing that. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.